The last years of the 1870s carved the Arizona Territory into a place of dust-worn hopes and rugged silence, where men either learned to bend like desert willow or broke like sun-cracked stone. On the far edge of that land, where the mesas bled into open sky, stood Red Creek Ranch, a spread as weathered and stoic as the man who kept it alive. Mason Reed had once known laughter in these hills, back when his family filled the cabin with noise and warm suppers, and the smell of bread cooling on the sill. But the fever winter took them all in a single ruthless season. Then came the land dispute the following spring. Gun smoke, a buried friend, and a long scar across Mason's ribs to remind him of what anger could steal. After that, the world quieted. Too quiet. People in nearby Dustwater town called Mason a solitary kind, a man shaped by wind and grief. A few said he was dependable as a church bell. Others whispered he was dangerous when crossed. But mostly they saw him as a shadow drifting along the frontier, unwavering, unreachable, always riding alone. He kept it that way. Every few weeks, he saddled his bay gelding and rode into town for the bare necessities: salt, beans, rifle cartridges, a coil of rope. He never lingered. A nod to the shopkeeper, a quiet thank you to the blacksmith, a curt tilt of the hat to women who tried to meet his eye. Then he turned his horse back toward the red canyons where silence swallowed him whole. Life at Red Creek moved with the steady rhythm of a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed. Feed the horses, patch the fences, check the water lines, sleep, wake, repeat. The wind became his closest companion, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, always honest. It curled around the eaves of the barn at night, whispering like the voices he once knew. When loneliness pressed too close, Mason would sit on the porch, boots propped against the step, staring across the barren plain until dawn peeled back the darkness. On one late afternoon, when the sun sagged low and the land burned gold, Mason was repairing the warped door of the horse stall. Sweat mixed with dust on his brow, and his shirt clung to his back from hours of ranch work. He lifted the hinge into place, set the nail between his fingers, and swung the hammer. That was when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the usual chorus of ranch life, hoofbeats distant but sharp, cutting through the windy hush. Not the steady rhythm of his own gelding, not the stumbling trot of a stray Mustang. This was different, urgent, controlled, coming fast. Mason straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans, squinting toward the horizon. A plume of dust rose along the narrow trail leading to his homestead. Whoever rode toward him was pushing their horse hard, too hard for a casual visit. His grip tightened around the hammer. Visitors were rare out here, uninvited ones, rarer still. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the canyon wall behind the barn. A hawk shrieked overhead, startled into flight. Mason stepped away from the stall door, boots crunching against the dry earth, instincts sharpening like a blade sliding free from a sheath. Someone was heading straight for him. He stood beside the corral fence, broad shoulders squared, jaw set with the gritty stillness of a man who had survived too much to flinch. Dust swirled around his boots as he waited, the late-day sun casting his shadow long across the yard. The rider burst into view at last, cresting the ridge in a blur of motion. Sunlight flashed off dark hair, and the curve of a lean body balanced effortlessly in the saddle. Mason could make out the silhouette now, small, swift, and unmistakably graceful. Not a ranch hand, not a lawman, a woman, a stranger riding straight into his life. Mason felt the air shift, subtle, electric, like the land exhaling before a storm. He didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything would change. The moment where one set of hoofbeats would shatter years of solitude. The moment that fate arrived at Red Creek Ranch. The rider slowed as she neared the ranch yard, dust swirling off her horse's hooves in windswept spirals. Mason Reed tightened his grip on the fence rail, watching the figure come into focus through the desert glare. What he saw made him straighten instinctively. The young woman dismounted in one fluid motion, light, controlled, and untamed as a swallow diving across open sky. Her horse, a lean bay with a scarred flank, snorted and shook its mane, clearly worn from a hard ride. She slipped a hand along the animal's neck, murmuring something soft in Apache. Her voice was low, melodic, steadying both horse and man. Her name, though Mason did not know it yet, was Julia Evans. Her hair, long and ink black, was braided tight against the wind, adorned with a single white feather and a strip of red-dyed sinew. The braids framed a face burnished by sun, with sharp yet soulful eyes that held a quiet storm behind them. Her skin carried the warm copper tone of her Apache blood, but the cut of her blouse, the worn traveling skirt, and the battered satchel slung across her shoulder spoke of a woman shaped by two worlds. Julia Evans did not belong fully to either. She glanced toward Mason, hesitant, alert, reading him with the instinctive caution of someone who'd spent her life straddling cultures that rarely trusted one another. There was a resilient calmness in her posture, but it carried an undercurrent of urgency. This wasn't a social visit. She had ridden here with purpose. "Are you Mason Reed?" she asked, her voice smooth but guarded. Mason nodded. "That's right." Julia exhaled, more relief than breath. "I was told you live alone, that you don't take kindly to strangers." She paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "But I'm hoping today you'll make an exception." Mason didn't answer. He simply leaned one forearm on the fence, waiting. He had learned long ago that people tell you the truth faster when you give them silence. Julia lifted her chin, revealing the steel beneath her gentle exterior. "My name is Julia Evans," she said. "My parents, John and Linda Evans, are on their way here. They'll arrive within a day or two." Mason recognized the names. Settlers from the East, respectable, educated, carefully polite but quietly wary of anything they didn't understand, including Apache blood. Julia seemed to read the recognition in his face. "They adopted me when I was a child," she explained, her voice quiet but firm. "Raised me in a white household, gave me their name, taught me their ways." She looked away, jaw tightening. "But the world never let me forget I wasn't entirely theirs." The way she said it, soft, steady, bittersweet, made something shift inside Mason's chest. Julia stepped closer, boots crunching on sun-baked dirt. "I've spent my whole life walking between two fires. To the Apache, I am changed. To settlers, I am Apache. No matter where I stand, someone calls me an outsider." She took a breath, bracing herself. "My parents mean well, but they're worried. Worried that this territory is too wild for me. Worried that no man out here would see me as anything but trouble." Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with frustration born from years of fighting to belong. "They want me to leave Arizona, to return east, to start a proper life where the world is calmer, cleaner, and far from my people." Mason didn't move, didn't blink, only listened. Julia looked him straight in the eye now, and he saw a raw determination beneath her exterior. Resolute, brave, wounded, hopeful. "I can't go back," she whispered. "The East may be civilized, but it's not home. And if I refuse, my parents will insist on sending me to a government settlement for Apache women, a place where they reshape you into what they think you should be." A shadow crossed her face, dark as thunder. "I won't be remade, not again." She hesitated, then, with visible effort, forced the final truth out. "So I told them something I must now make real." She swallowed. "I told them I had someone here, a man I intended to build a life with." Mason's brows lifted slightly. Julia pressed on, desperation flickering beneath her steady tone. "I need someone strong enough, respected enough, to convince them I'm safe here. Someone this territory listens to." Her gaze locked with Mason's. "Someone like you." Wind swept across the yard, tugging at her braids, sending dust skittering across Mason's boots. For a moment, the ranch seemed to hold its breath. Julia stepped closer, voice low, vulnerable yet unwavering. "Mason Reed, I need your help." The sun was sinking behind the jagged mesas when Mason finally finished securing the corral gate. The sky had turned a deep, blood-red dusk, the kind that made the whole frontier feel suspended between day and night, hope and ruin. He wiped a line of sweat and dust from his neck, ready to retreat inside before the desert cold settled in. That was when someone knocked on his door, 3 sharp raps, hurried, trembling. Mason's hand instinctively moved toward the revolver on his belt. Folks rarely came calling at this hour unless trouble was riding at their heels. He stepped onto the porch, boots heavy on the wooden planks, and pulled open the door. Julia Evans stood there, framed by the dying sunlight. Her breath came uneven, her braid wind-tattered, her face touched by a shaken vulnerability that didn't match the composed young woman he'd met earlier that afternoon. The feather in her hair trembled in the breeze. Her eyes, sharp, soulful, looked strangely bright, as if carrying a storm behind them. "Julia," Mason's voice was low, wary. "You all right?" She tried to swallow, but the words lodged in her throat before she forced them out. I need to speak with you. Inside, please." He stepped back without a word, allowing her in. The cabin was dim, lit only by the last slants of red light through the window. Julia stood in the center of the room, arms wrapped around herself, as if bracing against an invisible wind. Mason waited. Silence had always been his strongest language. After a long moment, Julia lifted her eyes, filled with something raw, a mix of fear and determination. "My parents," she whispered. "John and Linda Evans. They'll be here tomorrow." Mason nodded slowly, urging her to continue. Julia drew a shaky breath. "I told you earlier that they worry for me, that they don't want me living out here alone, not as an Apache girl in a land that's turning meaner by the year." She paused, voice trembling. "But what I didn't tell you is, they're coming to take me back, east, away from this territory, away from anything Apache." She looked toward the floor, the weight of her words sinking like sand in a desert storm. "I can't let them. I won't go." Mason felt something shift. Sympathy, maybe, or recognition of a fight he understood too well. Julia forced herself to speak again, her voice thin but unwavering. "To stop them, I told them something. Something I can't take back." Mason stiffened, the room suddenly colder. "I told them," she whispered, "that I have a fiancé." The word hung between them, heavy, impossible. She lifted her chin, revealing eyes glistening with desperation. "They believe I'm promised to a man out here. Someone steady, someone this territory respects. Someone strong enough to convince them I'm not alone, and not in danger." Her breath faltered. "I told them his name was Mason Reed." Mason's jaw tightened. He looked away, exhaling slowly through his nose. He'd been dragged into wild situations before. Land wars, stray bullets, drunken cowhands, but nothing like this. A pretend fiancé? For a woman caught between two worlds and two civilizations tearing themselves apart? It felt absurd, reckless, dangerous. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Do they plan to stay?" Julia stepped closer, emotion flickering across her sun-warmed features. 3 days, maybe 4. Just long enough to decide whether I belong here or whether they should take me away." The room settled into a thick, aching stillness. Outside, the desert wind moaned against the cabin walls. Julia's voice softened to something earnest and fragile. "I chose you because you're not a man people whisper about. You don't stir trouble. You don't use cruelty as a language." Her gaze locked onto his. "And because you helped me once, when those scalp hunters chased me by the creek last month." Mason remembered, her frantic horse, the gunshots, her terrified eyes. He'd stepped in without thinking. He rarely intervened in other people's business. But Julia had looked like a bird pinned beneath a hawk's shadow. "You saved my life," she murmured. "And today I'm asking you to save it again. Not with bullets, with your name." Mason felt something twist in his chest, an old, reluctant ache. He'd sworn never to tangle himself in another person's future. His own past had turned to ashes quickly enough. But Julia, her fear was real, her resolve was resilient, and her eyes, those steady, hopeful eyes, carried a plea he couldn't ignore. He ran a hand down his tired face, swore under his breath, and finally nodded once. "All right," he said quietly, "I'll do it." Julia's breath escaped her in a trembling rush. Relief, gratitude, and something softer. Mason looked away, as if embarrassed by the weight settling between them. "But only until your folks leave," he muttered. Julia's faint, exhausted smile flickered in the half-light. And somewhere outside, as the sun slipped below the canyon rim, the first threads of destiny tightened around them both. The next morning broke sharp and pale, the air still cool from the night winds drifting down the red cliffs. Mason barely slept. He'd spent most of the night pacing his dim cabin, wondering what kind of fool's trouble he'd stepped into. By dawn, he'd only grown more tense. Julia, on the other hand, stood near the porch with her hair freshly braided, the feather in place, her face holding a steady resolve despite the shadows under her eyes. She had ridden at first light to check the trail, then returned with a single warning. "They're Kunwaner, they're close." And they were. By mid-morning, dust rose along the main road. Thick, swirling clouds kicked up by a wagon rolling toward the ranch with fussy determination. Mason watched from the porch, arms stiff at his sides, as the Evanses arrived in a polished carriage entirely unsuited for the harsh frontier. The horses were glossy, the wheels too clean. Everything about it screamed Eastern comfort dropped into a world too rough for polish. Julia stepped forward just as the wagon halted. Before the wheels had fully settled, Linda Evans swept down from her seat with surprising agility. Her skirts fluttered like startled quail feathers as she rushed toward Julia. "My darling girl." Linda pulled Julia into a fierce embrace, her hands cupping Julia's cheeks with almost frantic affection. But when she turned, her gaze sliced sharply toward Mason, piercing, appraising, quietly disapproving. So this was the woman he had to convince. John Evans climbed down slower, adjusting his hat, his posture carrying the rigid pride of a man accustomed to getting straight answers. He surveyed the ranch, the corral, the tools, the dust, and then finally Mason. The older man gave a small grunt. Not friendly, not hostile. More like he was inspecting livestock he wasn't yet sure was worth the asking price. Mason felt sweat break along his collar, despite the morning chill. Julia stepped between them, her voice gentle but firm. "Mama, Papa, this is Mason Reed." Linda's eyes narrowed slightly. John's brows rose. Mason offered a stiff nod, wishing for the first time in his life that he had practiced smiling. "Mr. Reed," John said, extending a hand, "we've heard a great deal about you." Mason shook his hand, trying not to think about how untrue that statement was. "Sir." Linda folded her hands, her tone dripping polite suspicion. "So you're the young man Julia plans to marry?" Mason coughed, too hard, nearly choking on air. Julia stepped lightly on his boot, a warning hidden behind a sweet smile. "Yes," Julia said quickly. "We've been talking about the future." Linda clasped her hands with overwhelming enthusiasm. "Wonderful. Then naturally we should set a date. A sooner date, given the dangers of this territory." Mason froze, his brain sputtered like a dying campfire. "A date?" he echoed. Julia jabbed his ribs with an elbow so subtle Linda couldn't see. "Yes," Julia said through her teeth, still smiling. "We were thinking soon." Linda beamed. Mason nearly fainted. Meanwhile, John Evans had wandered toward the barn, peering through the open door with the frown of a man assessing everything from the hay quality to the nail placement. Mason hurried after him. "You keep your tack oiled?" John asked. "Yes, sir." "Shoes your own horses?" "Yes, sir." John nodded thoughtfully, scraping a hand over the stall door. "A man's worth can be measured by how he cares for his animals." Mason stiffened. "I do right by mine." John grunted approval, or something close to it. Inside the cabin, matters weren't going much better. Linda admired the place with a strained smile, careful not to touch anything dust-coated. "So tell me," she said sweetly to Julia, "when will you two be moving into a home more suitable?" "Soon," Julia lied seamlessly, though a faint tremor touched her voice. Linda's attention snapped to Mason again. She reached out and, without warning, lifted Julia's hand and placed it firmly into Mason's. "Hold her properly," she instructed. Mason nearly jumped backward. Julia's fingers tightened around his, warm, trembling, earnest. The touch startled them both. His heart thudded unreasonably hard. Julia avoided his eyes, cheeks flushed. Linda nodded with satisfaction. "Yes, a couple should look devoted." Julia's pulse raced. Mason's did too, though neither dared show it. The charade had begun, and if the tension twisting through the cabin meant anything, it was clearer than ever. Pretending might be far harder than either of them had imagined. Red Creek's frontier market was already buzzing by the time Mason, Julia, and her parents rode in. The sun hung bright overhead, catching on bright cloths, weathered saddle leather, and tin pots displayed by traveling merchants. Horses snorted, chickens fussed, children darted laughing between the booths. The air carried the scent of mesquite smoke, dried peppers, and fresh bread. An odd comfort in a land so often ruled by silence. To Mason, the market was usually a place to move through quickly, head down, purpose fixed. But today he found himself walking beside Julia, matching her pace as Linda and John trailed just a few steps behind like watchful hawks. People noticed Julia the moment she entered, her braids, her warm copper skin, the soft feather trembling in her hair. But none stared rudely today. Perhaps it was the way Mason walked beside her, tall and rugged, his expression making it plain that anyone with unkind intentions would have to go through him first. Julia surprisingly seemed happy. She laughed, a bright, sun-warm sound Mason had never heard from her before. It pulled his gaze again and again, like a rope he couldn't quite cut loose. She lingered over baskets of woven blankets, admired jars of honey, tasted roasted corn offered by a Mexican family who recognized her from childhood trips with her parents. "You used to run through this market barefoot," Linda said, touching Julia's arm with nostalgic affection. Julia smiled shyly. "I remember." But the moment Mason caught her eye, something flickered between them, something quiet, unexpected. They wandered toward a jeweler's booth, where silver glinted in the dusty light. Rows of bracelets, brooches, and pendants lay neatly arranged, many etched with Apache sun symbols, bear claws, and river patterns. Julia paused before a small silver necklace shaped like a rising sun. "It's beautiful," she murmured. The jeweler, a stout Navajo man with kind, wind-stirred eyes, nodded. "Made by an Apache craftsman near the Salt River. Strong piece, meant for someone with spirit." Julia reached out but hesitated, fingers hovering. Mason noticed, then surprised himself by lifting the pendant first. He held it out to her. "You should have it," he said, voice strangely soft. Julia blinked, startled. "Mason, I wasn't asking you to—" "I know." His thumb brushed hers as he placed the necklace into her palm. "Still, you should." A single touch. That was all it was. But for reasons Mason couldn't name, that brief, sun-warm contact felt like stepping too close to a fire. Dangerous, comforting, impossible to ignore. Julia didn't pull away either. Her fingers lingered around his, just for a breath, before she closed them around the necklace. Linda, watching with a smile far too satisfied, clapped her hands together. "Well," she announced loudly, "if that isn't the sweetest thing, you two look like a pair of newlyweds." Julia nearly dropped the necklace. Mason coughed hard enough to make a passing cowboy stare. Linda only laughed, brushing imaginary dust from her skirt. "Oh, don't be modest. It's lovely seeing young love." John grunted in agreement, though the man was clearly too busy evaluating the structural integrity of the fruit stand to truly care. Julia's cheeks turned a soft, embarrassed rose. Mason felt his own ears heat beneath his hat brim, and yet neither corrected Linda. Neither spoke a denial. They simply stood there side by side, sharing a silence that didn't feel awkward, just charged, like the stillness before a summer storm. They moved on, weaving through the crowd. But now every glance they shared had changed. Every brush of shoulders seemed to spark a memory of that single, accidental touch. Mason found himself watching the way Julia smiled at the world, the way she softened around children and stiffened near drunk ranch hands, the way sunlight glowed against her skin. He told himself it was part of the role he had agreed to play. But roles shouldn't make a man's heartbeat hitch like a startled horse. As they approached the end of the market, Julia walked beside him in comfortable quiet. Somewhere behind them, Linda whispered to John, her tone playful, almost smug. "They're in deeper than they admit," she said. Julia heard her. Mason did too. And neither knew what troubled them more, the risk of being discovered, or the fear that Linda's jest might no longer be entirely false. The afternoon light thinned into long amber streaks across Red Creek Ranch, the kind of fading sun that made wooden fences glow and dust hang in the air like a quiet spell. The market had tired everyone. Linda returned to the cabin with Julia, fussing over supper preparations. But John Evans had other plans. He turned toward Mason with a look that was stern, weathered, and impossible to misread. "Walk with me," John said. It wasn't a request. Mason followed him across the yard, boots crunching against dry earth. They stopped behind the cattle shed, where the wind pushed against the fences with a restless hum. It was a lonely corner of the ranch, nothing but red dirt, the faint smell of hay, and shadows stretching long toward the canyon. John folded his arms, studying Mason with the intensity of a man who'd spent a lifetime weighing truth against danger. "I'm going to ask you something straight," he began, "and I expect an honest answer." Mason swallowed, jaw tightening. "Go on." John's eyes narrowed, sharp as a rancher appraising a horse's gait. "Kauka that long voy con guida kong?" The words struck harder than Mason expected. Somehow, despite rehearsing this lie in his head, despite agreeing to the charade, his tongue froze. He'd stepped into this role to protect Julia from being uprooted, but now, standing before her father, standing before the raw truth of it, He felt strangely stripped bare. He tried to answer with the story they'd prepared, but it fell apart the moment it reached his lips. I, I meant to say what you want to hear, he admitted slowly, but I reckon the truth's better spoken plain. John didn't flinch. Then speak it. Mason took a breath, the wind tugging at his shirt as though urging the truth out of him. Your daughter, he began carefully, is one of the strongest people I've ever known. Not strong the way some men brag about, loud and careless, but the quiet kind, the kind that survives storms without letting the world see the cracks. He paused, unsure whether to continue, but something opened inside him, something he hadn't realized was there. When she looks at this land, he said, she doesn't see a wasteland to endure. She sees something worth fighting for, worth belonging to. There's courage in her, a soulful, unwavering courage I haven't seen in years. John's expression changed, barely, subtly, but enough that Mason noticed. And, Mason added, voice softening, she brings a sort of warmth to this place. The ranch feels less empty with her around, less quiet. I didn't expect that. It was the closest Mason had come to confessing anything real in a long, long time. John studied him for a long moment, the wind rustling through his silvered hair. The older man's gaze softened, not with approval, but with recognition, as though he had seen the same thing growing inside Mason that Mason himself had yet to name. You care for her, John said quietly. Mason didn't answer. He didn't have to. John stepped closer, voice lowering into something more intimate, more dangerous. Mason Reed, Julia has lived between two worlds her entire life. Neither claimed her fully, neither protected her fully, so she learned to protect herself. He paused, letting the weight of that truth settle. If you ever break her trust, he continued, you won't just answer to me. His voice dropped to a raw whisper. This desert remembers pain. It carries it, echoes it, and it will swallow a man who brings heartbreak to a girl who's already had too much. Mason met his gaze, unflinching yet shaken by the earnest warning. I don't aim to hurt her, he said. John nodded, satisfied, though not reassured. Good, see that you don't. They stood in silence as a dust-laced gust swept down from the ridge. Somewhere near the porch, Julia laughed faintly at something her mother said. The sound drifted through the air like a warm ember, reaching both men. John's voice softened. Whatever this arrangement is, make sure it's not built on sand. Mason swallowed, nodding once. John looked toward the cabin. Come, supper's almost ready. As they walked back across the yard, Mason felt the truth of John's words settling into him. Heavy, unsettling, impossible to ignore. He had agreed to pretend. But somewhere in the quiet spaces of Red Creek Ranch, something real had begun to take root, and he wasn't sure he could stop it. The next afternoon carried the soft warmth of early summer, the kind that loosened the desert winds and set the world glowing. Linda suggested a picnic near Red Creek. Something civilized, she said. Something to remind Julia of gentler days. Mason suspected it was also a chance for John to study him further, though the man said nothing of it. They rode out together, the Evanses in their tidy wagon, Mason and Julia on horseback. The land unfolded in tawny waves, dotted with sagebrush and clusters of cottonwoods, bending over the narrow ribbon of the creek. Sunlight shimmered on the water, bright and clear as polished glass. Linda spread a blanket under the shade of a cottonwood and fussed with jars and tins. John wandered upriver to inspect the fishing prospects, but Julia waited only a few minutes before tugging lightly on Mason's sleeve. Walk with me? She asked. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held something weighty and wind-worn, something she'd been carrying alone. Mason nodded. They stepped away from the blanket, away from Linda's cheerful chatter, following a narrow dirt path to where the creek bent sharply and the world fell quiet. Only the murmur of water and the distant call of a hawk filled the air. Sunlight dappled the ground through swaying cottonwood leaves. Julia stopped at the edge of the bank. For a moment, she didn't speak. She simply stared at the water, as if searching for courage in its ripples. Mason stood beside her, hands in his pockets, waiting with the patience of a man who'd learned to let truth come when it was ready. At last, she exhaled a slow, trembling breath. Mason, she said softly, I'm losing track of what's pretend and what's real. He turned to her, but she kept her gaze on the water. When we're around my parents, I tell myself it's just acting, just a story we're holding together. Her fingers began twisting the silver sun pendant he'd bought her. But then there are moments, small ones, where I forget to pretend. Mason's heartbeat stumbled. Julia swallowed hard. When you handed me this necklace, when you walked beside me at the market, when you talked to my father yesterday, she shook her head, eyes bright with something raw and soul deep. None of that felt like an act. She finally looked at him, and the world around them felt utterly still. Mason, she whispered, her voice fragile but determined. I don't know where the pretending ends anymore. For the first time in years, Mason felt something inside him shift. Something he'd buried beneath dust and silence and loss. He'd meant to guard himself. He'd meant to help her only out of decency and obligation. But somewhere between the quiet glances and shared steps, between her laughter at the market and the way she softened the ranch's emptiness, he had changed too. He stepped closer, not touching her yet, but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin. You're not the only one confused, he said quietly. I keep telling myself I'm just doing what you asked, playing the part. His voice roughened. But Julia, every time you smile at me, every time you look at me like I'm something more than a man living in the dust, I forget what's real and what isn't. The confession trembled between them. No embrace, no kiss, just truth, bare and unadorned. Julia's hand drifted, barely touching his. Their fingers brushed, hesitant but electric. That delicate, trembling contact felt more intimate than any kiss could have been. For a long, breathless moment, they stood side by side, shoulders almost touching, watching sunlight dance on the river. The breeze softened, slipping through Julia's braids, tugging lightly at Mason's shirt. The world seemed to hush in respect for two hearts admitting what neither had dared say aloud. Julia spoke first, her voice gentle. Whatever this is, it scares me. Mason nodded. Me too. But, she added, her fingers brushing his again, I don't want to run from it. Mason swallowed. The rugged, steady part of him, the part shaped by storms and loss, gave way to something tender, aching. Then we won't, he whispered. They fell silent again. Not out of discomfort, but because silence was the only language big enough to hold what had just awakened inside both of them. Behind them, Linda called faintly from the picnic blanket. John's voice followed. The world resumed. But beside Red Creek, where water glimmered beneath the afternoon sun, a quiet truth had been spoken. And nothing between them would ever be pretend again. Night settled over Red Creek Ranch in a slow, hushed descent, the kind of darkness that wrapped itself gently around the land, rather than smothering it. Stars pricked through the sky like cold silver nails. The desert wind softened to a whisper, brushing against the cedar posts of the porch. Mason lit the oil lamp, its warm glow spilling across the wooden planks. The small flame flickered in the breeze, casting long shadows behind him. Buddy, the old ranch dog with a graying muzzle, ambled over and dropped heavily at their feet, groaning contentedly. Julia sat beside Mason, her knees pulled close, the feather in her braids swaying with each shift of the wind. After the river confession earlier that day, something between them felt subtly, yet unmistakably, changed. Not louder, not bolder, just deeper. A slow-burning truth threaded through the space between them. For a long while, neither spoke. The silence was easy, the kind that didn't demand filling. Then Julia drew a breath that trembled slightly at the edges. Growing up, she began, voice soft and raw, I always felt like a borrowed child. Mason turned to her. My parents loved me, she continued quickly. John and Linda, they gave me warmth and safety. But out east, I was always the Apache girl in the white school. Someone to be pitied, or praised, or stared at. She looked down at her hands, fingers twisting the hem of her skirt. Never someone who truly belonged. The lamplight softened the sorrow in her features, but didn't hide it. And when I visited my birth people, she said quietly, they'd look at my dresses, hear my English, see my Western manners, and call me changed. Some wouldn't speak to me at all. Others would say it under their breath. Lost root, half remembered, caught between. Mason felt something tighten in his chest. He'd always known Julia carried weight. He just never understood how heavy it truly was. She exhaled, the breath drifting into the warm lamplight. I spent so many years trying to make myself small enough to fit both worlds. But no matter what I did, one side always saw me as not enough. Her voice thinned. Sometimes, I don't know who I'm supposed to be. Buddy nuzzled her boot. sensing her sadness. Julia offered him a faint, grateful smile. Mason leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The porch creaked beneath their weight. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost too quiet for the night to carry. "I know something about not fitting anywhere," he said. Julia lifted her gaze, curious, tender, steady. "When the fever took my family," Mason continued, "I stayed here because I didn't know where else to go. But this ranch, this land, it stopped feeling like a home. It was just a place I worked until my hands bled." He stared out into the fields, dark and endless beneath the moonlight. "I shut myself off, figured if I didn't let anything in, nothing else could be taken from me." Julia's expression softened, aching, wind-worn empathy glowing in her eyes. He swallowed. "For years, the only voices I heard were my own, and the wind, and Buddy snoring loud enough to wake the dead." Buddy thumped his tail in agreement. Julia's soft laugh warmed the air. "But then you came," Mason said, the words trembling with truth. And for the first time in a long time, the quiet didn't feel empty. The confession lingered, fragile but unwavering. Julia looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he felt the weight of her gaze settling somewhere deep inside him. Then she whispered, "Here, I feel safe." The words struck him harder than a bullet ever could. Not because she said them, but because of how she said them. Like she had never felt safe anywhere before. Mason's breath faltered. He turned toward her fully now, the lamplight painting her face in warm gold. "You make this place feel like a home," he murmured. "The first real home I've had in years." Julia's eyes glimmered, not with tears, but with recognition. Two souls finding something they'd both been missing. No embrace followed, no kiss. Just the quiet union of two people who had spent their lives wandering separate deserts and somehow found each other on the same porch. The oil lamp flickered between them, casting a soft halo of light. Buddy sighed contentedly. And the night, long, deep, and honest, held their shared truth with the gentleness of a promise yet to be spoken. Morning came soft and gold over Red Creek Ranch, the kind of warm sunrise that brushed the sky in gentle strokes and made the land feel a shade kinder. Mason stood near the porch, hat in hand, while Julia helped her parents gather their things. The wagon waited on the road, horses stamping lightly in the cool air. Linda Evans adjusted the last buckle on her travel bag, then turned toward Mason with eyes already shining with tears. Without warning, she stepped forward and wrapped him in a hug. Tight, heartfelt, startlingly fierce for such a small woman. "Mason Reed," she said, voice thick with emotion. "You've given my daughter something she never had before." Mason blinked, stiff with surprise. Linda pulled back just enough to look at him. "You've given her a place where she can breathe. A place where she doesn't have to choose which half of herself to hide. Don't lose that. Don't lose her." He opened his mouth to speak, but she squeezed him again and whispered, "You make her happy in a way no one else ever has." Then she let go, dabbing at her eyes as she hurried back toward the wagon. John approached next, slow, measured, the way a man does when he has something weighty to say. He extended his hand. Mason took it. The handshake was firm, rugged, full of unspoken judgment, yet carrying an unexpected warmth beneath the roughness. John leaned in slightly, voice low. "Don't let her walk away, son." Mason's throat tightened. I won't, sir." John gave a single nod, sharp, decisive, then climbed into the wagon beside his wife. The reins snapped and the horses lurched forward. Dust rose around the wheels as the wagon rolled down the long road away from the ranch. Julia walked a few steps before stopping. She watched the wagon shrink into the horizon, past the cottonwoods, past the bend in the road, past the point where distance blurred everything into shimmering gold. Only when it vanished completely did she turn around. Silence stretched between her and Mason. Not empty, not awkward, but pregnant with everything unspoken. The wind had stilled, as if the desert itself held its breath. Julia took a slow step toward him. Mason felt something shift inside him, that same raw ache that had followed him since the night on the porch. He swallowed. "Julia," she didn't answer. She kept walking until she stood only inches away, close enough that he could see the flecks of amber in her eyes, close enough to feel the warmth of her breath. For a moment, neither moved. The world narrowed to two heartbeats beating far too fast. Mason dipped his head slightly, unsure, afraid to cross a line she hadn't drawn clearly yet. "Julia," he murmured again, softer this time, like a man speaking a prayer he wasn't sure he deserved. I don't know what happens now, but He never finished. Julia stepped forward and caught his shirt in her hands. Small, steady, resolute. She rose onto her toes and pulled him down into a kiss that wasn't hurried, wasn't panicked, wasn't borrowed from their act. It was real. Slow-burning, certain, soul-deep. Mason froze only for a breath before everything inside him gave way. Years of loneliness, years of quiet, years of keeping the world at arm's length. His hand slid gently to her waist, tentative at first, then with a tenderness that felt both new and inevitable. Julia's lips were warm, confident, sure of the path she'd chosen. When they finally parted, the world seemed painfully bright around them. Julia stayed close, her forehead resting lightly against his chest. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Ha, that wasn't pretending. Mason swallowed hard, one hand rising to cradle the back of her head, feather and all. No, he said, it wasn't. For a long moment, they stood alone in the wide yard. Buddy circling their legs, the breeze stirring just enough to rustle the dry grass. The ranch, once silent and hollow, felt fuller than it had in years. Julia lifted her face, eyes glowing with a mixture of courage and vulnerability. Mason, she whispered, I choose this. I choose us. He cupped her cheek, thumb brushing gently along her sun-warmed skin. And I'll choose you, he answered, every damn day if you let me. Their foreheads touched. The sun climbed higher, the desert breathed, and the last pieces of the charade fell away, leaving only truth. Word travels fast in small frontier towns, faster than stagecoaches, faster than gunsmoke. By the time Julia spent her first night on Red Creek Ranch, Dustwater Town was buzzing like a kicked anthill. Some folks chuckled with good-hearted amusement. Some raised suspicious brows at the idea of an Apache woman sharing a home with a rugged rancher. A few whispered nonsense about impropriety and unsettled blood. But no one, not even the boldest of them, dared say a word within Mason Reed's earshot. A man who'd lived through gunfights, fever, land wars, and loneliness was not someone people tested lightly. Julia paid the gossip no mind. She walked into the ranch house with her sleeves rolled up and her spirit steady, saying she'd stay just a few weeks to help fix the place. Everyone understood the excuse for what it was. A thin veil for something deeper brewing, but Julia said it with such gentle confidence that even the wind seemed to nod along. Mason didn't question it either. He simply made space for her. And slowly, two broken lives began stitching themselves into something whole. They painted the cabin walls together, brushing over years of dust and sorrow. Julia's laughter echoed in the small rooms, bouncing off the logs, filling the spaces where silence once lived. Mason found himself smiling more than he had in years. Soft, quiet smiles that came easier each time she turned toward him. You missed a spot, she teased one afternoon, tapping a streak of white paint onto his arm. Mason wiped paint back onto her wrist, pretending it was an accident. Her grin, sun-warm and unguarded, nearly knocked the breath from him. They repaired the fences next, walking long lines of posts beneath cloudless blue skies. Mason showed her how to stretch new wire. She showed him how to bind cracked cedar with rawhide, using an Apache technique far sturdier than anything he'd known. Stronger together, she said. He didn't miss the meaning beneath the words. Then came the horses. Restless, neglected creatures Mason had once cared for with devotion, before grief hollowed him out. Julia seemed to understand them the moment she stepped into the corral. She whispered Apache words that carried a soothing cadence, and even the jumpiest mare lowered her head under her touch. You've brought life back into this place, Mason murmured one evening as they brushed down a bay gelding. Julia looked up, her eyes soft but knowing. You just needed someone to remind you it was still here. Weeks passed, and the ranch began to shift, not in the shape of its buildings or the stretch of its land, but in its spirit. The air felt warmer, the nights less sharp, the silence gentler. Two hearts that had spent too long wandering alone found themselves falling into step beside each other. One golden evening, they stood at the edge of the pasture as the sun dropped low, painting the whole plain in molten amber. The horses grazed quietly behind them. The wind carried the faint scent of sage. Julia's braid moved with the breeze, the feather bobbing like a small white flag of peace. She spoke softly, her voice threaded with wonder. It's strange. A lie meant to save me from a future I didn't want. Somehow it led me to the truest thing I've ever known. Mason felt those words settle deep inside him, grounding him like roots in hard earth. He reached for her hand, slow, steady, and she laced her fingers through his without hesitation. "No more pretending," he said. "This is your home, and I want you here, for as long as you'll stay." Julia turned toward him, her expression full, tender, and fiercely alive. "I'm not going anywhere, Mason." The wind swept across the grass, stirring the world into motion. Julia's dark hair lifted like a banner, wild and free. Mason stepped beside her, shoulder brushing hers as they looked out across the vastness of Red Creek. The desert had felt lonely for so long, unforgiving, endless. But now, with her hand in his and the future stretched open before them, the land seemed softer, less brutal, more hopeful, almost sacred. The Wild West was still wild, still harsh, still dust and danger and wind. But for the first time in years, it wasn't empty. Two figures stood together on the ridge, bound not by lies nor survival, but by something stronger, a real love, steady as the land beneath their boots. And Red Creek Ranch, once a refuge of one lonely man, finally became a shared home.